Welcome to the Creative Penn podcast. I'm Joanna Penn, thriller author and creative entrepreneur, bringing you interviews, inspiration and information on writing craft and creative business. You can find the episode show notes, your free author blueprint and lots more at thecreativepenn.com, and that's Penn with a double N. And here's the show. Hello creatives, I'm Joanna Penn, and this is episode number 799 of the podcast, and it is Saturday the 15th of March 2025 as I record this. In today's show, I'm talking about writing as a tool for grief with Karen Wyatt. We talk about the different types of grief that we deal with throughout life, using writing to deal with complex emotion, when something is personal writing and when you might consider publishing it, how to deal with family members or friends who might have issues with your writing, aspects of spirituality in grief, and more. I was also recently on Karen's show, End of Life University, talking about how to write non-fiction about difficult topics like grief, so you can also have a listen to that if you enjoy our conversation. So that's coming up in the interview section. In writing and publishing things, well, it's all about audio again this week. So a few weeks ago, Spotify announced the integration with 11 Labs AI narration. So you can publish those files through Findaway Voices, owned by Spotify, and they will be on Spotify as well as some other platforms. And I said at the time when I announced that, what will the response of Amazon be? Since this will no doubt bring AI narration into the mainstream. And we already have the response. So it looks like Amazon is now rolling out Audible Virtual Voice, AVV, their AI narration service into other territories. So it has been available in the US and on limited beta, invite only, for over a year. And I think the last report on it, there were over 40,000 books, but that was maybe about 6 months ago, so there's probably a lot more. Now this, as I said, it's been US only, invite only, and I got an invite this week, and I've heard from other authors in the UK, Canada, and also more authors in the US that they also now have access. I don't think this timing is coincidental. So while it's not available to everyone right now, but my invitation actually went into spam and I didn't know I'd got it. And then I went to my KDP dashboard and the button had appeared. So basically what happens is once you get invited, you get access to this button. So on books which have no audio version on your KDP dashboard, you'll see a little button that says add audiobook with virtual voice. Now, to be eligible, your ebook must be enabled for all territories, worldwide rights or United States, but that probably is most indie authors. It's only English or Spanish, and I'm sure that will change over time. And they have a whole list of eligibility things, but it looks like you can only see the eligibility list if you have access to this AI virtual voice, Audible virtual voice. So if you get the email or if you get the button, and then you might find that email in your spam, as I did, then it's at least worth having a look. There are more than 50 voices so far, various accents, and it is free to create them at this time. This is a big deal. It is free to create the audiobook. Now, you can set a list price, but of course on Audible, many books are included in the plus and also many are on credit, so you're unlikely to get that entire list price for many listens. KDP currently offers 40% royalty rate for audiobooks with virtual voice sold on Amazon and in Audible stores where KDP supports audiobook distribution. So that's Audible app, audible.com and .co.uk, I presume, Amazon Music Unlimited, Alexa and Amazon.com. Now, the big thing, of course, is this is exclusive audio. They own the files, so you can't download and sell them elsewhere. I checked the terms and conditions and it says you retain all ownership rights in and the copyrights and all other rights and interest in your books. We retain ownership in the AVV Audible Virtual Voice Edition file. So yes, remember to always check the terms and conditions. So how does this compare to 11 Labs? Well, first of all, it is free to create. Now, I get emails almost every day saying, I can't afford the 11 Labs, $100 really, so what is free? And this is free. So it's a pretty good offer, to be fair. And it is Amazon and Audible, so you get good distribution, but you can't sell the files anywhere else. So this is what I thought was going to happen. Basically, if you want to be wide with audio, either you use human narration, or you have 2 sets of AI files, AVV for Amazon Audible and 11 Labs or Google Auto Narration for Spotify and other platforms, including Kickstarter, including Shopify, including any other way of selling direct. So I can't see this changing either. I think obviously Amazon and Audible have always had a very exclusive mindset around content, so I can't see them suddenly enabling it, although of course if 11 Labs could get their files into Audible, it would be fantastic. So there's a virtual voice studio, which is where you can preview and edit the audio and hear what the audiobook will sound like. You can add pauses, change voice speed and edit pronunciation. Now, I did have a go at this just before I did these notes. I wanted to have a go on Catacomb, which is a male narrator, so I haven't done it myself. I selected the voice. It generates an audiobook cover for the ebook. If your ebook is in KDP Select, the audiobook will be enrolled in Audible Plus. I found the studio thing very easy to use, but it is not as directable as 11 Labs. So if you really love your audio and you want a lot more control, you will want to use 11 Labs. If you want to sell direct, you want to use 11 Labs. But I did like the feature where you can just select a word. So in Catacomb, it's like a monster horror set in the catacombs under Edinburgh. And the beast is called the Grensloach, which is a sort of Grendel from Beowulf meets the Sluach, which are these Celtic spirits of the dead. And so I was like, okay, Grensloach. But of course, pronouncing that is hard enough. So you can just highlight the word, overtype it with phonetics, and it will then change the whole book. So I thought that was good. I think this will very swiftly accelerate the amount of audio available. And also people are going to get used to AI audio very quickly. Now, if you're like me and you already listen at 1.3 or 1.5 or 2x already, you will know that it matters very little and the quality is already amazing. Now, obviously, this is not going to stop human narration. I'm still going to human narrate my non-fiction, any more memoirs I write, probably my short stories, because then I can get it on multiple platforms. And I absolutely support human narrators continuing to do their thing. I think, as I've said for many years now, there's going to be a stratification of rights where some books are done with AI and some books are done with humans. But certainly I have just signed a contract for my first set of AI narrated audiobooks. It's a French language contract. And for my Matt Walker series, and the contract specifically is for AI audio, and I'm fine with that. I think it's a way to get audiobooks out there. As I said, the quality is excellent, and that is what this company are doing a lot of now. So there you go. But this has also shifted my thoughts on Death Valley. So just last week, I said that Human Me would narrate the audiobook of Death Valley. But this announcement with AVV, Amazon AVV, has changed my mind because I think the acceptance of AI audio will come faster than expected. And so I have a JF Penn voice clone on 11 Labs, and my voice clone is going to narrate Death Valley. And I'm going to be working with someone on that, and I will talk more on that to come. I am also planning to license that voice, so I'm going to have 2 voices. One is JF Penn narration voice, which is a little darker, a little less upbeat. And then I'm going to have a virtual Joanna Penn voice as well, which I'm going to train. And that is going to be available for other people to use. So if you would like me to narrate your book as virtual Joanna Penn or virtual JF Penn, that will soon be an option. I'm thinking of having like a landing page on my site for books like that. And I'm just considering how that might work, but I'm definitely interested in doing that. Obviously, I wouldn't be involved, but I still think it's cool. I am also going to link to an episode of the show, and you can go back in the backlist to have a listen. December 4th, 2020, I did an episode on the podcast called Voice Technologies, Streaming and Subscription Audio in a Time of AI. And a quote from that episode: AI voices will narrate mass market audio content with human narrators producing artisan audio experiences. Now, so that is just over 4 years, I guess. And I'm usually 4 or 5 years early, so we're right on time with this one. That's a chapter from my AI book that I did. Well, my book on AI, I should say. There are also more developments from Spotify this week. They've just launched a new publishing program for indie authors. They've said Spotify Audiobooks is thrilled to be opening submissions for short-form content written by independent authors who are as passionate about audiobooks as we are. We know Spotify users love exploring these intense, bite-sized listens, and expanding our audiobooks catalogue in this way gives fans even more choice in the content they love to consume on our platform. This is a global programme, and any author with an English language short-form story who controls their own audio rights for that story can submit. If Spotify chooses to move forward with an authored submission, Spotify will publish the audiobook, which includes paying in advance and royalties, managing all aspects of production and distribution to major audiobook retailers. Make sure your story is a novelette of approximately 10,000 to 20,000 words. So this is interesting because I was like, yay, short stories, gonna submit them. And then I'm like, 10 to 20,000 words. Wow. I've actually never written fiction in that bracket. So the longest short story I have is 8,000 words, which is, I think that's The Extinction of the Nephilim. So 10,000 to 20,000 words, and then my shortest novellas are sort of 27,000. So I was like, okay, this is interesting. They want quite a specific length. So it's around 9,000 words per hour listening on 1x. So I was thinking that is probably people like me who listen on 1.2 or 1.3 usually, or up to 1.5, depending on the speed of the narration. So if I listen on 1.5, I can definitely get maybe 12,000, 15,000 in an hour. So I think that's what they're aiming for. I've said before on the show that I talked to someone at Spotify and they said people who commute, their average commute is like an hour, and people want something to be able to listen in an hour. So that would be, I think, more the 10 to 15,000 range personally. They also say focus on 3 genres: romance, mystery thriller, or sci-fi fantasy. Personally, I think that is more than 3 genres. Do you sci-fi fantasy people get annoyed with being lumped together? I certainly read a lot of fantasy and I rarely read sci-fi, but I think they're 2 different genres. I also think mystery and thriller are different genres, but there you go. So they've said 3, but it could be 5 genres. They also say cross-genre is fine: romantasy, dark romance thriller, mystery, sci-fi, or psychological thriller. No erotica or children's content. The story must sound great read out loud, featuring sharp characters, atmospheric settings, and engaging dialogue that leaves the listener feeling something and wanting more. So I'll link to that in the show notes. In my book, Audio for Authors, there is a chapter on writing for audio, as you need to write differently. And in fact, as I say this, I had mentioned last year around updating old editions. It may be time to update Audio for Authors, given how much AI audio has moved on. But there is a chapter in there about writing for audio, as you need to write differently and keep in mind the ear of a human rather than the rest of the brain, I guess, the eye. If you read with the eye, you skip over things. So, for example, one of the most common recommendations for authors is to use the word said. And said disappears on a page, on a written page. The human eye will just skip over said. But when you're listening, the repeated use of said and other repeated sounds can put listeners off. So try using action instead of dialogue tags. So we're not saying change it to whispered or all of that. You just need to make it obvious to the listener who is speaking. For example, Morgan crept down the stairs, gun outstretched before her. There's something down here. So you know that Morgan is the speaker. You don't have to say Morgan said. So that's just one of the tips. And there's also an interview from 2019 in the backlist on writing for audio first with Jules Horn, who also has a book on the topic. Link in the show notes or just search the backlist. I think this is really important, especially with this Audible virtual voice, because with 11 Labs, you can actually edit the text. And as the author, that's completely fine. So you can kind of edit things as you go through. But with the Audible virtual voice, you can't edit it. It needs to match the ebook. They just do it from the ebook. So you need to be much clearer. So that is lots on audio. It's certainly been a big week. I would say this is the tipping point week or month maybe, with the Spotify 11 Labs announcement and this announcement. This is the tipping point. But also, good news for printing and selling direct. BookVault is now printing in Canada, as well as Australia and the US and UK. So if you use BookVault, you can select printing locations per book. That is great news because the shipping can be prohibitive in Canada and Australia. So, in personal news, well, I am back from Iceland, which was a combination of book research and also celebrating my 50th birthday. I am now on the other side of the hill, as several people have emailed me. And I actually quite like that symbolism, and the view is even better from over here. So it was a great trip. We made it out to the Snæfellsnes National Park in the West Fjords to see the Black Church at Búðir. And we also saw the Northern Lights at out near Thingvellir National Park, which was a highlight. We were so lucky with the weather. The sky was clear. It was very cold. So we had some blue skies during the day, and then we had the Northern Lights at night. And there are some pictures on my Instagram and my Facebook. And I've also done a blog post about it with photos and tips and book recommendations. It's at booksandtravel.page/blog or link in the show notes. Also really liked the street art and the sculptures around Reykjavik, and we went in the Sky Lagoon, in the hot pools, and it was all generally a lovely trip. So yes, have a look at that if you're interested in Iceland, and yes, I will be writing some kind of story, either a short story or something else about Iceland. On other landmark moments, I have put another blog post on the Creative Penn, Measure Your Life by What You Create, 50 at 50. So I've been writing seriously since 2006. That's 19 years. It's crazy. And I've had a card on my wall for many of those years. Create a body of work I'm proud of. 50 books by 50. And so I had to do a post this week assessing whether I'd made it. Now, the problem, of course, is what is a book? You might think that's simple, but what if you do multiple editions of multiple books? So, for example, How to Make a Living with Your Writing has had 3 editions. How to Market a Book, I think, is 3 editions. Obviously, some of my fiction, I've had several editions. So when you do multiple editions, it's the same book, but you've still done all the work to rewrite that. Also, what about short stories? What about co-writing? All those things, short fiction versus long fiction, all of that. Short non-fiction things as well. So I made a point system. And by my point system, I did make it to 50 by 50. But in terms of the actual totals, excluding multiple editions, I've written 12 full-length non-fiction books, 8 short non-fiction books, 18 full-length novels, 6 novellas, 12 short stories, and a memoir. So I'm pretty happy with that. Many authors have written much more than me. Many authors have written a lot less than me. So we don't need to measure ourselves against anyone else. We can just be happy with what we have. And since I measure my life by what I create, I'm pretty happy with that. Link to the post in the show notes, or it's just on thecreativepenn.com on the blog. I posted the link on X with the question, did I make it to 50 at 50? And MCA Hogarth commented on X, amusingly, this didn't go the way I expected. So I'm going to create a complex measuring system to tackle the question was a plot twist only logical from someone who writes thrillers, which made me laugh. So I had to win somehow. I couldn't say, oh no, I failed. So in other podcast appearances, I'm on the Biz Book broadcast with Liz Scully, talking about writing the shadow, why embracing the shadow side can help us write more deeply and lead to greater creativity. And especially important in this age of AI that we, as ever, double down on being human, and the shadow side is definitely very human. Also coming this week, my Books and Travel podcast returns. And in the first episode, launching this Thursday, 20th of March, I'm doing a solo episode, well, I've already recorded it, reflecting on why I'm bringing it back. And of course, there are 92 other episodes in the feed, and they are all evergreen. So there's no news segment. It's about different places and topics and attitudes. Just search Books and Travel wherever you're listening to this, or go to booksandtravel.page/listen to find links and the backlist. So thanks for all your emails and comments and photos this week. Nina says, I was very touched by your episode with Jacob and how you both allowed yourself to wander into places you hadn't expected. Jacob's point about having used the day job as a funding source really resonated with me. It has started to make me regard my own day job less as an obstacle and more as an enabler. Loved this slow, reflective episode that got at the heart of what we do. Thank you, Nina. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Andrew sent an email. I mentioned the 11 Labs speech-to-text new tool, and Andrew emailed to say, I've been using dictation since the first version of Dragon Naturally Speaking. When I went full-time as an author a decade back, dictation was critical, but I was never satisfied with Dragon's accuracy and eventually went back to typing, which is okay, but dictation is my flow state and how I do my best writing. I've tried multiple AI solutions and they didn't work for various reasons, but 11 Labs is amazing. It's exactly what I've been looking for, and I'm back to walking and dictation with word counts like the old days. Thank you so much. You have no idea how helpful this has been after years of trying Dragon alternatives that never quite worked. This is great to hear, Andrew, because I haven't tried it yet, but I think this is very good to know. I also have problems sometimes when I interview people, particularly on that Books and Travel podcast, if people have different accents. Often, like Dragon and many of these tools are very good for American voices, very good for male voices. But if you have like a woman with an Indian accent, for example, then it doesn't work so well. Or a woman with an Irish accent. It doesn't work so well. So this is great to hear. I'm looking forward to playing with this myself. So that is the 11 Labs. They have a speech-to-text tool. And Lee sent some gorgeous pictures of graves by the mountains and said, love, love, love the podcast and the books and everything you do. In late February, I was in Big Bend National Park for some hiking in far west Texas, one of my favourite places on the planet. There are some small towns near the park entrance, one of which is Terlingua, Texas. I've been coming to this cemetery for years. It looks really cool, so thank you for that, Lee. Okay, so please leave a comment on the podcast show notes at thecreativepenn.com or on the YouTube channel. Send me a message on X at thecreativepenn or email me. Send me pictures of where you're listening, joanna@thecreativepenn.com. I love to hear from you. It makes this more of a conversation. So today's episode is sponsored by Draft2Digital, and I use Draft2Digital to publish my ebooks wide onto various platforms, including Apple these days. Are you an indie author in need of an easy and efficient print-on-demand service backed by a world-class customer support team? Look no further than D2D Print from Draft2Digital. D2D Print is ideal for authors who've already published ebooks but haven't yet experimented with print. With D2D Print, you can convert an ebook to a print-on-demand file with just a few clicks, turn an ebook cover image into a full wraparound print cover in seconds, choose from dozens of beautiful interior layouts for that professional look, choose from a variety of industry-standard trim sizes and formatting options, distribute your print-on-demand files worldwide. You can even use Draft2Digital's free ISBNs. You can order author copies within 32 countries and order print proofs from a variety of shipping options without proof stamped on your book. You can also use free change tokens every 90 days to make updates to your published print books. All this and more with no setup or recurring fees. Print on demand is a game changer for indie authors because while brick and mortar bookstores can't physically stock every book, they can check for the print on demand availability of a book when a customer requests it. If you only publish digital books, you could be missing a huge opportunity to reach more readers. Let's fix that with D2D print. Learn more for everything you can do at draft2digital.com. That's draft and then the number 2digital.com. So this type of corporate sponsorship pays for the hosting, transcription and editing. But my time in creating the show is sponsored by my community at patreon.com/The Creative Penn. Thanks to the 21 new patrons who've joined in the last 10 days, bit of a bumper lot, and thanks to everyone who's been supporting for months and years. If you join the community, you get access to all my backlist videos and audio covering topics on writing craft and author business, as well as tutorials and demos on AI tools and my patron-only Q&A solo episodes and my live office hours. The next one is coming in a few weeks at the end of March. In the last week, I've shared a video tutorial on using 11 Labs for audiobooks with Simon Patrick, one of our community and an expert in AI audio. And I also went through the new Amazon audiobook virtual voice process on another post. It's been a busy week. The Patreon is a monthly subscription, the equivalent of buying me a black coffee a month or a couple of coffees if you're feeling generous. You get access to everything, all the backlist content, Q&As, office hours. So if you get value from the show and you want more, come on over and join us at patreon.com, patreon.com/The Creative Penn. Right, let's get into the interview. Dr. Karen Wyatt is a retired hospice physician and best-selling author of books about death, loss and grief. She's also the host of the End of Life University podcast and an inspirational speaker. And today we're talking about her book, Stories from the Dark Night, Writing as a Tool for Grief. So welcome back to the show, Karen.
Thank you, Joanna. I'm so excited to be talking to you once again.
Yes. Now, it's been a while. So first up, tell us a bit more about you and how you got into writing and publishing.
All right. Well, like so many of your guests that you interview here, I've always been interested in stories, and I started writing stories when I was 7 years old, and I wrote a 3-act play when I was 10, but which my school ended up producing. So I'm actually, I guess I could say I'm a published playwright, my one and only play, but always loved writing down my thoughts and ideas and telling stories and writing them down. And I kind of got waylaid in terms of writing by becoming a doctor. So I had a number of years there of intense schooling, and then I was a doctor and a wife and mother at the same time and had very, very little time for writing. It was precious time if I ever could just sit down and jot down a little story that was in my head. But the creative juices kept flowing, as I know you've talked about, like just ideas every day for stories or things I wanted to write. But I always had to put that aside. I was just too busy. So I finally retired from medicine early, and I was a hospice physician for a number of years. I retired early so that I could write, because I'd been gathering all these stories while I worked in hospice, amazing, beautiful stories from patients I worked with. And I just knew it's time for me now to shift into writing mode. So I retired early 15 years ago and started writing then. And I hadn't really thought about what it takes to publish a book. I didn't know that, but I finally started delving into that. And through you and your podcast, I learned about independent publishing, and I've been able to publish my books myself. Most of the time, though, I worked once with a hybrid publisher, and then most recently with Watkins Publishing from the UK. And so it's been a really fun journey for me of finally having a chance later in life to get into the writing that I started when I was 7 years old.
That's wonderful. Well, just on the being drawn to the darker side? I mean, obviously, as a doctor, you could have gone into many different areas and ended up in being a hospice physician, and now you're writing about end of life. So has that always been an interest? I mean, I guess I'm saying this from the perspective of someone, as you know, I have always thought about death. Oh, like from the very young age, I remember thinking about death and dying. So it's always been on my mind. I wondered if that was true for you.
I did have some interest in death and dying. I had a classmate of mine died when we were 16 years old, and that kind of really woke me up to the idea that, oh my goodness, everyone dies and you could die at any age. And I started really contemplating my own mortality at 16. Like, you know what? Nothing's guaranteed. I could die at any time. So I will say death has been on my thoughts since a young age. And then early in my medical career, my father died by suicide, and I was really plunged into this whole world. I call it my dark night of the soul, in a way, of grief after his death, which is what led me into working for hospice, because I realized, even though I had thought about death, I didn't really know anything about it, and I didn't know anything about grief. Even though I was a doctor, I hadn't had any training in that area. So I started volunteering for hospice to help me understand what I was going through. What am I going through here as I'm grieving my father's death? And ultimately I shifted my whole career to hospice because I found it was just a rich, very spiritual, sacred place to be, a sacred way to be a doctor, with working with patients and families, and very powerful for me. So it was really grief itself that shifted my path as a doctor initially. And then again, as I said, I started gathering so many stories and learning so many things about this process of loss and how we navigate it and cope with it in life, that I really felt inspired to start writing and talking and teaching about it, because at that time it seemed like a very taboo subject. I think it still is in many ways.
It's so weird. You said there that as doctors, you didn't really get into the death side of things, which just seems so crazy to me because it happens to 100% of people. And it's like a physical process, obviously much more than that. But why aren't doctors trained on this kind of thing?
It's so bizarre. I still can't wrap my head around why is that, but partly because modern medicine focuses so much on curing illness and saving lives that death has become the enemy. So we don't want to think about that or talk about that because we don't want it to happen for our patients. And it's ridiculous because it does happen. And I think back when a patient was approaching death in the hospital when we were in training, suddenly that patient was taken off our service. We didn't follow them anymore because, well, they weren't a good teaching tool now because they're going to die. We'll move on to the patients that we can cure because that's what we're here to learn about. And it really doesn't make any sense, but it's part of why we have a problem with how we take care of people at the end of life. And I think why I just felt inspired, like I want to help do this differently. And that's why hospice was so appealing to me.
And why books and writing and talking about these things are so important, because there's, as you say, a lot of taboo, and perhaps even more taboo around the way your father died. Just lots of things that come up. But before we get into that, I just wanted us to talk about the word grief, because it feels like there are many forms of grief. It is not just if we are dying, or if our partner is dying, or our family is dying, or if someone is dying. So what are some of the other ways that grief might come up for people and might help them if they're feeling certain ways?
I think it is important for us to recognize that we feel grief whenever major changes take place in our life. I had a mom tell me she grieved when her child no longer used baby language, like started talking and saying words normally, and they lost all the cute little expressions that their toddler used to say. When that was over with, she felt grief because it was a big change and something shifted and she lost something. So we can feel grief even in times of happiness rejoice when good things are happening. And if you think about it, life is one series of loss and change after another. And so it makes sense in a way. Grief is kind of an emotion that's always present for us if we really look at it.
Is it a change that is out of our control rather than something that we can control? So I'm thinking personally, I feel like when I went through menopause, I felt a lot of grief over losing a sense of who I was as a younger woman, I guess. And then I feel like a lot of anger that is, as we record this in 2025, there's a lot of political anger in different sides, and also anger around AI, kind of maybe taking people's jobs. And all of these things are not choices that are made deliberately. They're things that are almost out of our control. So how much does grief and control sort of go together?
Oh, I think definitely. I mean, I think the way we cope with grief or navigate grief has a lot to do with control. If we have any sense that I can control my surroundings, I can change what I need to change, that gives us a little bit more resilience and more ability to deal with the losses that we experience. But when it feels outside of our control and there's nothing we can do, I think that is the deeper form of grief that's very hard to manage. And as you said, because it's associated with a lot of anger, as from the ego level, especially like anger. How is it that all of this can happen to me and I can't do anything about it?
Yeah, so let's come into writing then. When these feelings overtake us and we really just don't know what we're doing, why is writing so useful when it comes to grief, and how has it helped you in particular?
Well, I think grief, as we already said, it can contain such a mixture of emotions. And we typically think of grief as just being sadness over a loss. But as you pointed out, there's a lot of anger within grief and guilt and regret, sometimes resentment, sometimes even relief. There's sometimes a joy that's present within grief. So it's a very complex situation with lots of emotions bubbling up all at once. And yet we don't know what to do with all of that emotion. And writing gives us a place to express it, to ventilate the emotion and put it down on paper. And we sometimes hesitate to express verbally to other people all of these things that are going on with us, this mixture of emotion during grief, because other people don't necessarily understand it and may not want to listen to it. And it's why writing is our place to communicate all of these crazy thoughts we have and confusing feelings that we have. And it's a safe, non-judgmental place. We can just put it down on paper and validate ourselves that we're going through this difficult time. And it doesn't always make sense, but we can express it at least and give voice to what is otherwise can be hidden or repressed inside of us.
And so with your father, how did writing help you? Like, was it just, things are bad, I'm going to write this essay or this poem, and then suddenly I feel better? Is that how it worked?
No, not at all.
Obviously not. But
I didn't even think of the idea of writing itself. I didn't even recognize that could be therapeutic in some way. But at the time of my father's death, I happened to be reading Julia Cameron's book, The Artist's Way, and where she talks about doing morning pages every day. I had been intrigued by that idea before of doing morning pages. And I found I was waking up early every morning. I couldn't sleep and I had dealing with this insomnia. And I was actually really busy. I was a mom and a wife and a doctor, and so busy I felt like I don't even have time to deal with grief or to deal with my emotions during the day. I'm just busy having to do all these things. So I would wake up at 4 a.m. and couldn't sleep. And I remembered morning pages, and I started just getting up early every single morning and writing. And morning pages, it's stream of consciousness writing, where you just write down anything that's in your head. And much of what I wrote down dealt with, I'm angry, I feel guilty, it dealt with all these confusing, conflicting emotions I felt inside around my father's death. And I didn't even know for sure that was all happening inside until I started writing the morning pages, and it was all coming out of me, and it gave me a place to just, as I said, to ventilate and release those emotions. And it actually became a place where I was processing grief without even realizing it every morning, writing those 3 pages of stream of consciousness. So that's how I began with that type of writing, and I highly recommend it. I don't know if you've ever done it. I'm sure you've read the book, The Artist's Way.
Yeah, I've always kind of been a journaler, but I don't do morning pages like every day. But when I did, I feel like when I got divorced, my first husband left me. So it was out of my control. It was not my choice. And the sort of 3 journals that I have from that time are full of, and it's so repetitive. There's no point in me reading it back. And maybe it's the same with you. It's like, that is just raw emotion that every single day sounds exactly the same. And there is this period where that just happens, right? For a period of time, you can't really get past those initial emotions in your outpouring.
No, it's just, there's so much of it inside of us that needs to come out. And that's what I find. I'm writing the same thing every day, but Julia Cameron mentions about writing these morning pages. It helps us eventually get out of our logic brain, which in grief, the logic brain, she calls it, is always trying to figure out why this happened. It's always trying to figure out an explanation. It needs an answer for all the questions. But once you can move past the logic brain, you actually awaken the creative side of your brain, which can start to express things in symbols, and stories start coming alive. And the creative brain is actually figuring out, oh, this grief experience, this is interesting. How can I use that in a creative way to make something else? And that's, I think, for me, when I felt that shift happen, that's when I started to move into a more productive aspect of working through my grief, when I was really able to start processing it better and get past all these ruminating thoughts that just came over and over again.
And I think that's what's interesting in your stories from the dark night. It isn't just that stream of consciousness, grief. In fact, it's not that at all. There's all kinds of different sorts of writing. So tell us what happened when you moved into that productive side of it, and what are the types of writing that came out?
Well, I started writing whatever came to me, and I guess the morning pages opened that up a little bit, because after doing that for months and months, one day a poem came into my head, and I just wrote it down, and it happened to be about my dad's death. Another day, a story came to mind that I wrote about, and it seemed that everything I started writing, even though I didn't think it was related to my dad's death, ended up being about my dad's death in some way or another, symbolically or in some way or another. But gradually I just started having these creative impulses to write some little thing. I would write down whatever came to me, and I was still doing the morning pages every day, but at other times of day, something else would pop up for me, and I would write a story, or sometimes it was an essay. Sometimes I read a guided writing prompt that actually really helped me dive deeper into a subject. And some of the prompts were as simple as someone said, write something about the word leftovers and what that means to you. And something the word leftovers, like, how is that inspirational? And yet I ended up writing a whole piece on leftovers. It was just being able to get into that creative part of my brain and writing whatever came to me. But I also then went on to more intentional writing. So I started writing letters to my dad and expressing some things that I didn't get a chance to say before he died, expressing some of the deeper emotions that I felt around his death. And that was very therapeutic as well.
Yeah, on therapy, I think this is really interesting, because when my husband left that first, I'm very happily married, people, if you're listening now, I'm second married. But at that time, I didn't see a therapist. I'm not, even though we're doing a podcast, I'm not a talker. I didn't want to talk about my issues, but writing writing it down, I feel like writing all of that over the years it was really and sort of recovering helped me heal. And so I didn't need a therapist in some way. So where's the balance, do you think, for people between writing, helping with healing, and maybe needing to see a professional?
I'm much like you. I'm not much of a talker and not always wanting to share to talk with another person or looking for that kind of external help. I'm much more internally oriented. So I want to dive into my own psyche. I want to look at that. I want to explore it for myself. But I think for certain, whenever someone feels like they are just stuck and not getting anywhere and beginning to have very hurtful thoughts going through their minds, or thoughts of feeling hopeless and that they may never be able to move forward, never be able to find a way through the grief, then they might need an outside person who can come and help them reflect. For me, it's like my journal felt like a therapist to me. I guess I was in some ways dialoguing with myself, my higher self maybe, in the journal, and serving as my own therapist, because I could read back through what I wrote and see, here's something I hadn't thought about before, but it's right there in what I just wrote. And this insight is there for me. But for some people may not be able to do that. I may not be able to access that, a higher wisdom or a different perspective through writing alone. And they may really benefit from talking to someone else. So I always encourage people, seek out counseling, find a therapist, especially if talking is beneficial for them.
I think the other thing, there is a sort of, you mentioned insomnia earlier, and I do feel like there is a period of grief of many kinds that is closer to mental illness, which insomnia doesn't help, obviously. But at one point, I think in the DSM, grief was actually a mental illness, considered to be, very bad. But then it was recognized as a part of the human condition. So I guess to encourage people, if you're feeling like it is completely mad, then sometimes that is normal. It's just a case of how long that goes on for, I guess, a bit like insomnia. You have to get that sorted out at some point.
Because at some point it becomes destructive to your physical health. And if you find that you're not thriving and that you feel, in fact, that you're falling apart in many ways, I think it's really good to get input from an outside person and get help for that. It's funny, grief re-entered the DSM this past year as they created a new category, pathological grief, that they defined so that they could include severe grief, because I think they realized, first of all, it was a mistake to say any kind of grief is a mental illness, because it is actually a normal part of all of our lives. But then when they took it out, they realized, but wait, some people actually do get into a severe state of grief for which they need help. They may need medications, they may need therapy and counseling. So they made up a new diagnosis and put that back in.
I'm glad you brought that up then, because I thought it had gone and now it's back. So yeah, but no, of course there is a difference. And I think also some religious traditions, there are periods of time that and ways of addressing mourning and death where it's like for a certain amount of time you are expected to grieve, and then at a certain point of time you are expected to not forget it all, but to move on with your life. And it's almost like those rituals of death and dying can help. And in fact, you're a spiritual person, and you do put Matthew chapter 5, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, into your book. So how does the spiritual perspective help you in your life and also in your writing and for people who are grieving?
Well, it has been important to me, and it's one of the things I gained through my work, or I guess deepened through my work in hospice, observing people and families who were dealing with death in general, and how they all grappled with these universal concepts that I would say are not limited to any one religion, but actually present in all religions, of love and forgiveness and finding meaning and purpose in things. And so I gravitated toward that. That's these spiritual concepts that again, I'm not attached to any one religion, but I like the spiritual teachings and the concepts that are universal and apply to all of them. So those ended up being the things that where I found the most comfort, is being able to focus on love and just bringing more love into my life and acting with love, through love, and finding ways to love myself, even though I was feeling broken and in pain. And then forgiveness became especially powerful as well, because I realized one thing that held me back in grieving my dad was not being able to recognize how angry I was at him, and that I needed to forgive him for the choice he made to end his life. And when I was in denial of that for many years, and when I finally saw it, like, oh, I'm hanging on to this really deep-seated resentment toward him for the choice he made, and I have to be able to forgive him, because for whatever reason, that's what he chose, and that's what his life came to. And I'm hurting myself by not forgiving him. So that spiritual concept of forgiveness really changed everything for me. And I work with that all the time now, remembering like, oh, don't hold on to grudges. Don't be resentful. Just get over it. Just find a way to forgive, because holding on to that kind of anger can be really toxic.
Yeah, well, that is the other side of anger, isn't it? And anger is such a huge part of death and dying, no matter which side of it you're on. And yeah, it's something I think about a lot. And there's so much anger at the moment in the world, and I feel like some kind of forgiveness is so important, because it is just so toxic when everything is angry all the time. And I guess you would have seen that a sort of the idea of a good death, where there is acceptance of what's happening as opposed to anger as what's happening.
Yes, and I think the anger is normal and it has a place, so we need to accept it and embrace it, that, yes, of course we feel angry. Life didn't go the way we hoped it would, like we've lost all these things, but it doesn't serve us to stay stuck there if we can hold our anger and then see a bigger picture beyond that. And I guess that's the other thing. The spiritual perspective for me has become what I call it, the galaxy view of life, where you step back and look at everything from a bigger perspective, like looking down on planet Earth where we live, and how does this experience I'm having fit into the cosmos in a way, into everything that's happening here, and how do I accept it as this is just part of life, of this vast mystery of life. And I choose to move into curiosity sometimes instead of anger, like instead of doubling down and being angry about what's happening, being curious about, how did this arise and what will come of it? What will happen next and what will come from it? And then that puts me back into creative brain again. Once you're curious, you become creative and you can find ways of making the best of the situation that you're in.
So we've talked a lot, I guess, about the writing we do for the self, and you can put whatever you like in your journal and it can be as repetitive as hell and frankly quite boring for anyone else to read. But then obviously you've published several books about death, and this Stories from the Dark Night has personal writing, but it is not that repetitive original work, I guess. It's different. It's been transformed. So if people want to publish, obviously people listening are authors, how do you know how did you know when you were ready to share some of your writing about your dad and people and things that were difficult? Like, how can people move from personal writing to writing for publication around these difficult topics?
For me, I understood that I couldn't share this writing until I had clarity around it. And I needed to be free of anger and blame, because I understood like a lot of the things I was writing early on were filled with those mixed emotions, but just ventilating anger and blaming other people, blaming everyone, blaming life. And I realized that is not productive. I'm ventilating it. It's helpful to me to ventilate it. It's not productive for other people to read that. And I want to get to that place of this higher view where I'm not looking at it through the lens of anger or blame. I'm looking at it really more through the lens of love. And how could talking about the pain that I experienced, is there a way that could be helpful to other people? And how can I express that in a way that could foster healing and growth for someone else? And that took me years to get to a place where I felt like I'm not writing out of anger. I'm not writing because I want to use my writing to hurt someone. And if that makes sense to you, that's what I needed to get past, is making sure I had healed enough and I had enough clarity that I had the right reasons for putting my work out there. And then I chose very carefully what to share, because there are lots of things I didn't share. And trying to share things in that book, I was trying to share examples of what I wrote. Not that the writing itself is great, but I wanted to share examples of different ways that I wrote that ended up helping with my grief, different stories or essays or poems that I wrote that were helpful to me, just to inspire other people to do their own writing.
And there are writing prompts within the book, aren't there, each chapter?
Yes.
So you're really, I guess the main focus is when we write for ourselves, it is all about us. And then if we're going to publish something, it has to be a focus on the other person.
Yes, that's primarily what I was feeling, is how will this impact others, and can it be a positive thing if I share it that could inspire someone else and make them want to do their own writing and do their own work.
So also in the book, you talk about lifelines, and I thought it was a great term. So what do you mean by that, and how might people hold on to them when they're going through grief or other life changes?
For me, I had this, when I was really deep in grief, I had this image of being caught up in a tsunami, in a sense of just like these massive head waves, like rushing over me, and feeling like I was drowning at times. But somehow I would always come to the surface, and there was always something I could hold on to, just some little thing, like someone had thrown me a rope, and it was keeping me afloat, and it was helping me find my way back to the shore. Instead of getting lost and thinking about, oh, I'm so overwhelmed with grief, of thinking, oh, what was it yesterday that helped me get through? And then I would remember, oh, I heard that amazing song on the radio, and that reminded me of something Dad and I did together. Or I would find something. I found just a little note that my dad wrote to me when I was in college. I found it in a box somewhere, and seeing his handwriting, and it was so touching to me, but it actually brought me joy. And that little moment was like one of those lifelines. And so I started just paying attention to all kinds of things that were happening. Oh, and another thing was a bird song. My dad loved the meadowlark. We grew up in Wyoming, and it's the state bird of Wyoming. And I would, from time to time, I would see a meadowlark or hear a meadowlark sing. I started watching for those little things, those little tiny things, a moment, and like paying attention to the bird song. And I'd hear the meadowlark, and that was one of my lifelines. Like, oh, there's Dad. There's a connection with my dad. So when I started searching for the lifelines every day, and just noticing and paying attention, every day there was something. Every day there was some kind of reminder that helped me feel connected to him. And that those little things I felt like were just enough to keep me afloat when it seemed like, oh no, here comes the wave again. It's going to wash me under. But I would know there'll be something I can hang on to that will help me get afloat again.
And it's interesting because, of course, specifics like the sound of the meadowlark are what also bring our writing alive. So it's not just bird song. I heard a bird sing. It's always the specifics and paying attention. And I guess, again, that gives you an external, you're looking outside of yourself, not just being stuck in your head, which can, again, just help you keep going.
Yes. Yes, definitely. And yeah, looking for all the little symbols and little signs outside of myself that reminded me of Dad, sometimes even in a painful way, but oftentimes it was just poignant and sweet. The little reminders I would find, like this, my dad sometimes smoked a pipe with this cherry scented tobacco in it. And the smoke always smelled like cherries. And one day I smelled that. Someone was smoking a pipe with that scent, and I smelled it, and it was like, wow, this amazing, being transported in a way back into my childhood and being next to my dad. And so, it's incredible when I started paying attention, just how many little reminders there were. And for me, they were always very positive. Some people describe that they don't like having reminders because it makes them feel sadness over again. But for me, I always felt a mixture. I always felt the sweetness as well.
Yeah, that bittersweet, I think is the word. But what about your family and other people who knew your dad? Because one thing that people worry about sometimes if they do publish work about family members, that might be, a memoir or something that other people feel differently. And so what are your thoughts on that? Did other people read it? Was that not a concern? And what are your recommendations for people?
When I started writing about it, the thing I was most concerned was my mother and how she would feel about it. And initially I told my mom I'd written some stories and they have to do with my dad's death. And she said to me, I don't want to read them. Don't tell me anything about it. I don't want any of that. Don't talk about it or tell me anything. And then I was really worried, like, oh no, if this is out in the world and other people comment to her or other people read it, it will be upsetting to her. But the very next day she called me and she said, read the story to me. And so she had to get to a place of comfort. And for me, it was a real dilemma. Do I put this out in the world if my mom can't bear it, can't bear that this information is out there? So I read her the story, and the story was just my story of my experience. And that's what I told her. I'm not writing about what I think my dad experienced. I'm writing about my experience with grief when I found out my dad died and what that was like. So I really did keep it true and honest to my own experience without trying too much to conjecture on what my dad felt or what anyone else felt or anyone else's actions at that time. I kept to writing about what I experienced. Anyway, I read the story to her. We cried together. She loved it. And it was actually this incredibly positive, healing moment for the two of us because we hadn't been able to speak so deeply about our grief together in all these many years since my dad had died. And that story is what unlocked it for us.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I hope people feel like it, sometimes it can be a way to bring you together. I mean, again, we both said we're not really talkers, and I sometimes feel like I wish my family could read my books or would be interested in reading my books so they might understand how I feel, because I wouldn't be able to say it out loud, whereas I can say it in writing. And it's funny because I used to write a lot of letters, like up until I guess a decade ago, or maybe 2 decades ago now with email. Gosh, time flies. But I used to write so many letters in my teens, and then when I was backpacking in the early 2000s, and I feel like maybe that's something we don't do so much anymore.
Yes, that's so true. And like you there, I think talking is difficult sometimes to talk together about a painful subject. It's sometimes really hard to find the words, and we're in our left brain all the time. We're censoring ourselves constantly when we're trying to talk. And it's hard to have a really deep conversation with another person, but you can just write with honesty and integrity and be real and raw on the page and put it down. But again, for me, it's like I described before, I waited a long time before writing the story and then sharing that story until I knew, like, I am not I did not write this to try to hurt someone, to try to blame my mom or hurt her or my brother or cause them any pain. I made sure what I was writing felt pure to me. And so I think that's why it had a positive impact for her.
Well, we say we would rather write, but we both have podcasts, and I wanted to, as we come towards the end, I wanted to just ask about your End of Life University podcast, which I've been on. But tell people about that and what they can find on your podcast that might be interesting for them.
Well, I started the podcast back after publishing my first book about, it was 7 lessons for living from the dying, and realizing nobody really wants to buy a book about dying. People don't talk about this. Nobody wants to hear about it. And I realized it's not enough to write a book. I have to do something else to try to change this conversation around these topics. And I got the idea then. I started listening to podcasts myself and thought there needs to be a podcast on this subject. So I started doing interviews, and I discovered your podcast shortly after that. And I loved your style. I loved the fact that you have a more eclectic podcast, that you go in lots of different directions and you're just interested in everything, and so you have lots of different guests, a variety of guests with a variety of topics. And I decided that's what I'm interested in too. So I kind of modeled my podcast actually after yours, and inviting lots of different guests and having different types of conversations, thinking whatever we put out there should be helpful to someone. And the more people are able to hear conversations about difficult topics, the more comfortable they may get with having these conversations themselves. So I've been doing it I actually started in 2013 with my first interviews back then. So it's been a while, like you, not as long as you have been, but
It's amazing. And you do have so many different interesting topics and angles and different kinds of people. And so has the reception been what you wanted? I mean, you've obviously been doing it for so long. It's still of value to you and your community.
Yes, it's been, I don't really even know what I expected in the beginning. And at first, I only attracted people who worked for hospice, people who were already in the field and already had an interest. But over the years, I've attracted more and more people who are just being themselves introduced to grief and death in their own lives. And I've received some amazing feedback and wonderful stories from people. One young man told me a friend of his was dying, and he drove across the country to be with his friend, and he listened to the podcast all the way there in the car so that he would understand death and dying and grief. And he said it made all the difference. And he said, I came to his bedside and I knew what to say, and I knew how to be with him and how to be comfortable with my own pain and grief because of all the interviews I heard. And it was like, oh, wow, that's why I'm doing this. That's why I'm doing this. So it's a resource for people in a time of need who need to learn about something and want information. So when I get feedback like that, it tells me, okay, this is why I'm doing it. And it keeps me going, really, because it's actually hard doing a podcast. It's such hard work.
Wow, you gave me goosebumps then. And I know people listening will be affected by that, because every single person is going to be affected by grief at some point. And, whether it's ourselves or other people, it's going to happen. So absolutely recommend your podcast and your books. So tell people where they can find you and everything you do online.
If they go to the website, it's eoluniversity.com, and that stands for EOL is end of life, but eoluniversity.com. A link to the podcast is there, and to my books, and pretty much everything they need to know about me.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much for your time, Karen. That was great.
Thank you, Joanna. I've really enjoyed it.
So I hope you found the discussion with Karen interesting, and it is good to consider grief as a response to change, since there is so much of that happening, and sometimes we don't choose it. And of course, writing can help us through. Let me know what you think of today's episode, including what you think about AI audio and whether you intend to use the new Audible Virtual Voice or 11 Labs or anything else. Please leave a comment on the podcast show notes at thecreativepenn.com or on the YouTube channel, comment on X at thecreativepenn, or email me, joanna@thecreativepenn.com. And also, send me pictures of where you're listening or your favourite cemetery or churchyard. Next week, it's a craft show, and I'm talking about how ordinary drafts become extraordinary books with Christopher Jansmar. In the meantime, happy writing, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you found it helpful. You can find the backlist episodes and show notes at thecreativepenn.com/podcast. And you can get your free author blueprint at thecreativepenn.com/blueprint. If you'd like to connect, you can find me on Facebook and X at thecreativepenn, or on Instagram and Facebook at JFPennAuthor. Happy writing, and I'll see you next time.